Hello, Paula Paul, and welcome to the Tech for Non-Techies podcast. I'm so glad to have you here.
Hello, and thank you for having me.
When we originally spoke, we were speaking about the importance of open source. And I think this is something that most people have absolutely no idea about. And since Tech for Non-Techies, the Tech for Non-Techies audience is basically non-technical professionals, business leaders, lawyers, non-technical founders. I suspect that there are some people who don't even know what open source is. So shall we start with that? What is open source?
That is a great question, and I think you're right that there is a lot of confusion or even misinformation out there. And the fact of the matter is, we're all connected by the internet now, most everyone, and anyone can write a bit of code, hello world, and anyone can put that code out there on openly public repository. It's like donating your code to a public library. Does that make it open source? I would say not. According to the strictest definitions, there are organizations, the Open Source Initiative maintains formal definitions. So I would say open source is about software distribution, and that distribution is with a specific kind of license so that you could go to the library and check out the book, but you might not be able to read that book in a public setting and charge money for it. So it is really about how content in this case being code, is licensed for fair use or business use. And there's all sorts of different licenses out there and controversies about people believing one thing or another. And because, just like a public library, the code is available for people to go and look at, it's very easy to maybe even mistakenly misuse that code.
So I'm just thinking of this public library analogy because if you go to a public library, you can take a book out and take it home. But if you were to then, literally copy what's in the book and then put it into and put it on your site and say this is these are great ideas and they're mine now, then the author of that book would be completely within their rights to sue you, or their estate could sue you. So how does that translate to the open source world?
Oh, another terrific question. So we're starting to get into sort of the legalities of content, in this case being source code, and copyright. So the software industry was, I would say, originally completely closed. I started back in the day of mainframe programming, and even the programming language was something that I had to learn from IBM at the time. So it wasn't easily accessible to anyone. With a copyright, your audience knows better than I. I am not a legal professional. I'm a software engineer, but copyright protects the author and their works. In software, there were huge pushes in, I think, mostly the late 90s, maybe even late 80s, of making software free for everyone. The Free Software Foundation is something that's interesting historical motion. And a lot of this arrived at the concept of open source. It was actually a woman, Christine Peterson, who coined the term. So I'm always happy to point that out, that women have been in tech for quite a long time and making amazing contributions. So open source does allow different kinds of licensing, permissive licensing, and what they call copyleft licensing, meaning you get free access to everything in the book, but if you write another chapter, you have to also publish your chapter.
Why should we care? Why is it important to us to know what open source is?
We live in a society that relies on technology, which is software, which is likely all licensed one way or another. And the interesting statistics are that 90% of any given commercial software product or a website or anything that you're using at your company, or even this software that we're currently using to record this podcast, is built on open source software. So
So
it's almost like,
90%. So basically,
yep.
very much almost everything is built on open source. This is fascinating. So wait, hang on a second. So does this mean that most of the internet is basically built by free labor?
I
Because
would
it's volunteers,
say,
right?
yeah. And there are people who do get paid to contribute to open source projects, but the code
Wait,
is free.
so my mind is being so boggled right now because I'm thinking, Mark Zuckerberg, he's not a poor man. Jeff
Oh,
Bezos, not,
no,
not poor,
no.
right? Okay, so these tech billionaires have built these massively powerful companies, and these companies are mostly based on software created by volunteers. Is that right?
Well, the software itself often originates in a company. Like Facebook is a great example. They are the inventors of a software, a front end library, or a platform called React JS, or
Oh yeah,
the
we've used
JS
that.
in this. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's the JS piece is JavaScript, which is all
Mm-hmm.
open source. So React
Mm-hmm.
was based on open source JavaScript and built on top of that. They have they maintain that in an open source fashion. So you can build products using React, and you're standing on the shoulders of giants.
Interesting. So then why do people do this? Or like why because Facebook, they're not the most altruistic people. So why did they create this tool that people can use for free?
They're not making their money from the software. They're
But why
making
build
their
it at
money,
all? But like why
oh,
bother?
so that we can have this rich experience and bring more people into that ecosystem. And then the more people who are using React, the more people build on top of it. And then they also enrich that ecosystem. Facebook could take that and use that in their own internal platform, which is where they're really delivering their value. You talk about the valuation of companies. I would say that people are not establishing the valuation of Facebook based on their valuation of React.js. They're
Mm-hmm.
basing their valuation on what Facebook delivers in terms of value to its customers and its number of eyeballs and all that sort of thing.
So I remember in my first company, one of our products was a consumer app, and so basically we wanted to go on Apple and on Android straight away, obviously because then you increase your market. Although not necessarily like you don't necessarily need to do that because basically it's very different markets, very different behaviors. But that's a whole other. I had an episode on that already. But I remember that my CTO said, well, if we use React, we can release on both straight away. And at the time, React was a really young tool. Not many people knew how to use it. So we started using it. Then we ran into problems and we had to basically scrap that and then move to Swift to basically only do Apple. And
Yep.
this makes me think. So, by the way, for listeners, for if it went over your head, don't worry, you don't need to know what Swift is unless you are going to do stuff with the Apple App Store. In which case, then call Tech for Non-Techies will tell you what you should be doing. But what I wanted to say here is that it looks like kind of a business decision that basically says, okay, if app developers can release onto app stores simultaneously, that means that we are going to have more and more people basically logging in with Facebook, like more people are going to be tapped into our web. Is that the right way? Is that the kind of commercial web that would link creating an open source project with a very, capitalist company?
I would say there are many reasons, but I do think that I'm trying to draw again maybe an analogy to music. Are you,
Mm-hmm.
or books in a library, and it's the question of are you going to make your money by selling the music or performing the music? That's maybe oversimplifying.
Oh, interesting. No,
And
please oversimplify. This is great.
So I would say, and I do have some statistics that I'm happy to share links
Oh,
with you
please.
and
Yeah.
your audience, that about 60% of the open source projects out there all use one of three different styles of licenses, and two of those are what are called permissive licenses, that, this code is out there, you're free to do what you will. And one is called the copyleft, or sometimes you'll hear the GPL, the acronym. And a copyleft license means, here, this code is out there like a book. If you write another chapter, you must also publish your chapter. So you're restricted. In any other kinds of style of license, it's not considered open source. And I would give you a really interesting story on business model there. This is from the company HashiCorp, who some time ago, and I'm just looking at my history here, in 2014, they had a release of an open source project called Terraform. It became extremely, extremely popular. It was dominant for software that can create infrastructure in the cloud. So I could spin up storage in the cloud using code, which is repeatable and more maintainable for large businesses. In 2023, so very recently, HashiCorp changed the license, which was very permissive open source. They changed their license to what was called a business software license, meaning the code is still out there and you can look at it all you want, but you can't use it to compete with us. And that change was certainly a business decision. There's all sorts of rumors and so forth that people will say that was just driven by their private equity owners and fear of competition, which is valid.
Yeah.
But then the community that had been contributing to that software project, open source, for almost a decade, said, wait a minute, this is open source and it should be open source. So people took a copy of the open source permissive version, which they're fully able to do, and did what is called forking it, making a copy and publishing it in their own library and giving it a different name and then building on top of that. So I would say when you first publish software, the choice of license is very important, because I would say that decision by HashiCorp was not well received, and instead of blocking competition, it created competition, because now there is a fully open source library called OpenTofu that competitors are using to build their own cloud competitors. So I would say that, it's, again, do you make money from selling the music or from performing the music? And this is something I don't think is given enough thought. Another reason people choose open source, though, is because it is a great way to build community. And then there is a concept called open core. So you could open source the core of your software, but build closed source extensions or services on top of it. And these are the things that I think business owners or evaluations should consider.
Well, yeah, I really want to go back to that private equity HashiCorp discussion, because I think that is such an example of what I'm assuming. I mean, we don't know, but it really does look like, a bunch of finance people. And, I used to work in private equity, so I have been in these rooms where these decisions are made. I know how it works. And so the thing is, when you are investing in a traditional business, private equity did not grow up in the digital age. So it grew up before that. And so that's where pedigree comes from. And so lots of private equity players are not going to understand what you just explained. They're not going to understand that, okay, if we have this open source community, it's basically a bunch of people, a bunch of humans who are who have an emotional attachment to, doing this work. It's a bit like, if you're volunteering at, I don't know, if you're volunteering at as a cook in a soup kitchen on the weekends, and you're doing it out of like your sense of duty, sense of civic duty, and you also make friends with people in that soup kitchen who are all volunteers, and then all of a sudden that soup kitchen says we're now a for-profit restaurant, then you're going to be like, I'm definitely not cooking for you. This is not what I signed up for. This is not what I'm doing. Like, I was doing this for reasons to do with my soul. And I can totally see that a private equity firm just didn't know this, didn't understand this. Or maybe some people did, but the core decision maker, the partner who led the transaction, didn't. And then this way, then essentially what they did is they took a company, they made this change, and then they destroyed value spectacularly for no reason.
Yeah. And the public and this is such a perception was not good. And
and now we're making fun of them in front of loads and loads of people online, and we're probably not the only people.
Well, I love, some of my very best friends work at HashiCorp, and I love their technology, and I love HashiCorp Cloud, but I just don't think that was a wise business decision. But here I am. I'm not Mark Zuckerberg, hardly, as rich as the executives at HashiCorp. So there are a lot of things I don't know.
Well, really, I was making fun of the private equity people because I kind of feel like, having been one of them, I've got that license. But also, I do think that this is an example of where, when business leaders, and especially when business leaders who have a lot of money and power, and I notice this with people who have basically attained the upper echelons of success. They're like, I am brilliant. I know what I'm doing. And, they have this, it does come from somewhere. Usually these are self-made people who have, done spectacular things that we can all learn from. If you're good at something, it doesn't mean that you're good at everything. And I think that this is what I see with people, with business leaders sometimes, not only not having the information, like nobody comes out of the womb knowing what open source is, or that it powers the internet basically, but essentially not having the wisdom to ask questions and to delve in and to basically go to the other side, to the tech side and say, okay, like, what is this? Oh, there's a community of all these passionate people who are giving up their time for free. Okay, if we annoy them, then we might have some issues.
Yeah, or they'll take all their good work and go build a competitor to us. And that's HashiCorp's business license prohibits people from taking that code and building a cloud service that competes against them. And so maybe the original worry was, we're starting to see competition. And it's like, that's what I guess capitalism is all about, right? But how do you stop the competition? It's like, you have to build a better product. You have to offer a better service. Saying we're going to change the license on the source code didn't really stop the competition, and it kind of encouraged it, in my opinion.
Interesting. So what do you think is kind of the lesson that people really should get out of the story?
Well, I think two things. One is, a lot of really interesting technology starts as an open source project with an open source license, and a lot of those projects do so to build a community. I'm a maintainer on one, and I do think it's worth sitting down and saying, what would we do if this became wildly popular? And I would say there are a lot of things that you could do. That you could have what's called open core. You could say everything that's out there now is open source, and we're going to build some unique capabilities and differentiating capabilities on top of that. That's ours. I do have conversations with consulting companies who still say things like, oh, no one makes money off of open source. And I would say, as a consultancy, every single company makes money off of open source because your people consult and produce solutions that are 90% based on open source, and you don't have to pay for that code. So I would say consider how it is that you're going to deliver value to your customers if your source code is openly available. And it's kind of like, are you making money off of selling the music or off of performing the music? And the library analogy is also really great. So think about those things.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And I think this is what we've often, I mean, I've definitely heard venture capitalists talk about this, that I think a lot of venture capitalists kind of get annoyed that there's this misconception that, okay, if somebody's got this great technology, then they're just going to invest. And, that's not usually the case. The case is, okay, sometimes you need great technology, sometimes you don't, but you always need a path to commercialization. You need somebody to pay you for your stuff. That's it.
Yep.
Whether you've got an ice cream stand or a tech platform.
Yep.
And so essentially it seems that, okay, if 90% of the software being used in a tech company is open source, then the path to market, the marketing, the commercialization is like, that can never be open source, right? That's the secret sauce. And so that shows its importance even more. And you said that you are the president of an open source community. So can you tell us about that?
Oh, I'm very honored. I have the opportunity to serve on the board of the OpenJS Foundation, which is a steward of the JavaScript ecosystem. Because once open source projects become widely adopted, the other challenge is, if it is a volunteer effort, what happens when there's a security vulnerability? You can't just say, you volunteer person, wake up in the middle of the night and fix this security vulnerability. So you see large foundations now really looking at open source projects that are vital to the community as almost natural resources, like, the forests that we need to make sure are tended to. And the OpenJS Foundation stewards very large and important projects like Node.js, which is, billions of downloads a month. The projects like jQuery and NPM. You and your listeners don't have to know what these are, but many commercial companies, large banks and insurance companies and hospitals and governments depend on that ecosystem. So I do feel very fortunate to serve on the board for the OpenJS Foundation, and encourage anybody out there who depends on JavaScript to join the foundation and help us preserve that natural resource.
And so in this foundation, what do you actually do? You have a meeting, and can you tell me about some of the stuff?
Sure.
Discuss?
So open source is published, and it makes itself available to the world, really. But it's like saying, well, who builds, if it were books, who builds the libraries? Mm-hmm. So the foundation provides infrastructure and support for those projects so that they can be hosted for download and built. As people contribute to those projects, the code has to be built to be hosted. It also supports steering committees and working groups to keep those projects healthy. And we do have meetings as the board, but there are also very active security working groups for projects like Node.js, and working groups about the community health of projects. When there's a concern, they help ensure that security protocols are in place to address vulnerabilities. So it's a real service function, given that our world just runs on technology these days.
This is fascinating. So I'm also, I don't know, I'm kind of picturing like this beautiful global collaboration. So would, people contribute literally from around the world? And so you could get contributions from all sorts of people with completely different backgrounds, which I think, would make it so beautiful.
Yes, that's one of the things I love about open source. I've been in technology for a long, long time, decades. And to me, I advise women at the Need2Be organization and Grace Hopper Celebration and in general on you don't need to have a certain kind of passport or a visa in order to contribute to an open source project. You can collaborate with people around the world who are often very eager to teach you so that you can help contribute to bugs or what's called an issue. So I do think that it's a new way of working, and it does feel more like a public service because companies around the world, but also hospitals, governments, anything that supports people today depends on technology, and largely that technology is open source.
And this is also kind of making me think about all of these remote work discussions that everybody's having right now. And I mean, I don't have the answer because I seem to be annoyed wherever I am. I'm annoyed when I'm at the office because then people are bothering me. And then when I'm at home, I'm annoyed with myself because I keep on doing unnecessary household tasks because I don't actually want to, do serious business running things.
Yeah, it's easier to procrastinate.
Exactly. And, eat everything in the kitchen, right? So everywhere there is a danger zone. But the success of open source and kind of, the fact that the internet basically depends on it. And if the internet depends on it, then the economy depends on it. And it's been built entirely by remote teams, right? Like by people who've never met each other around the world.
Largely. And then I find small communities. There are lots of meetups around Node.js. Some of the best interactions I have with people are at these intermittent meetups and events. So it's not like I go to the office every day and suffer a commute or whatever, but there are ways throughout the year to connect directly with people. And I love that model best because it's somewhat the best of both worlds.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for teaching us about open source because I think most people are definitely not going to know that it is basically running the internet. And if it's running the internet, I mean, it's definitely running, most of the stock market right now, right?
Yeah.
So it's definitely something that we need to know about. And I would say to people who are especially going to be investing in tech, and if you're going to be investing in tech companies, this is something to find out about, and also to ask, like, what would you say that people should be asking if they want to invest in a tech company in order for them not to end up in that, private equity situation?
Yep. Certainly ask if they have open sourced any of their existing code or data. AI models are also in the open source sphere, and many are open source. A company called Hugging Face is very big in that area. I love their work. So asking about whether they've open sourced work, whether they're using a permissive license or a copyleft or a restrictive license, and then what their strategy is, both for understanding the dependencies that they already have on open source, as well as where they would see going with their own open source efforts, because it's beneficial to have an open source piece of your platform or product because it builds community.
And I think there was an episode that I did on dependencies. I'll have to check, but essentially, just a quick explanation. It's kind of like a Jenga tower where you have like one thing on top of another thing, and they all basically, as you build up, they all depend on each other. So if one of those things is going to become unavailable for whatever reason, because, for example, the license is changed, or because it stops working for whatever reason, then the bit above it in your Jenga tower is all going to fall apart.
Yeah.
And this is why, if you're a business leader, if you're a lawyer, if you're an investor, you are not going to understand exactly how that Jenga tower is made, and that you're not supposed to. That's fine. But just asking, like, what are the risks and the dependencies? Do we have legal risks? Do we have business risks? And legal risk is what you just described. But business risks is like, okay, what are these companies? What are they doing? If it's like, if a business depends on a tiny startup that is struggling to get funding, this is going to be really tough for you.
Yeah, exactly. You've hit it 100%. And I'll send you a link. I'll share with you some links after the podcast. And there's a very famous cartoon that always circulates at open source events. And it is a Jenga picture. And it has all these huge blocks on top. And it's this huge structure. And at the very bottom, there's a little toothpick. And it has an arrow and a pointer, and it says, this is some guy in Nebraska in a garage contributing to an open source project. So I'll send you that cartoon.
Oh, that's lovely. We'll use it to illustrate this episode. And also it's nice to think of that guy in Nebraska, so for all of the people who have contributed to open source projects, thank you. You are the unsung heroes of the digital age.